Hi, thank you for tuning in. My name is Dr. Amber Bryant, and I'm a project manager at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. More specifically, I work for the Inter-university Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, on the Peers Data Hub team, the partnership for expanding education research in STEM. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Alex Lishinski, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, about teaching and learning computer science. Dr. Lishinski's research expertise includes understanding students' self-efficacy, motivations, and dispositions as it relates to success in programming courses and applied mathematics. Dr. Lishinski, thank you so much for joining us. If it's okay with you, I'm just going to jump right in with our questions for today.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, awesome. So for the general population, when we hear the words computer science, what should we think of? Is it coding, programming? What is it exactly?
Yeah, so I think I come to this from a unique perspective, especially compared to some of my other peers in computer science education research, a lot of whom come from my kind of strictly computer science background, which is not my background. I'm an education researcher. My PhD is in educational psychology. And so when I think about kind of what should we kind of think, how should we understand computer science generally, I think of it as kind of there's two sides of it to consider. One being kind of the pure computer science discipline that's for computer science majors and kind of learning about these computer science topics in real depth and the course sequences that students take in computer science majors to learn that kind of stuff. I think also there's an important strand, and that has been particularly relevant to my research, that has to do with people that are not from computer science as from the field of computer science, or who aren't intending to be what you would call computer scientists. And so, especially in the last several years, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Especially in the last several years, there's been a lot more of a push for this CS for all, and there's been a lot of movement in terms of enrollments growing in undergraduate computer science classes, and a push to get computer science into K through 12 classrooms in various forms. And this is not about preparing people to be computer scientists per se, but it's kind of in recognition of the fact that for a lot of people, even outside of computer science, programming skills are becoming more of a necessity. So at the university level, you're seeing people from natural sciences and from other fields like engineering that need some kind of programming background, but who aren't obviously pursuing computer science as a major. And then when we get into the K-12 level, it's more about ways that we can introduce what we see as these important computer science concepts. Computational thinking is kind of one kind of broad umbrella that people think about the different sorts of problem-solving skills that they think are inherent to computer science. And it's more about getting those skills to students rather than teaching them strictly like a programming language, or getting them some sort of benchmark of programming skills. So that's kind of the two strands I see, and the second one being the non-computer science audience for programming skills, which I think is becoming more important all the time for people in different fields besides computer science and in K through 12 education, as you can see through all of the initiatives that have been pushed forward in the last few years to find ways to integrate that into those curriculums.
Gotcha. So you hinted a little bit at your history. Can you tell us a little bit more what brings you to this intersection of computational thinking and computer science and education? Like, how did you get here?
Sure. Yeah, so like I said, my background is not in computer science, which is different than a lot of people who do a lot of research in computer science education, but rather my field is educational psychology, and I come to computer science education that way. And so to kind of give you the very quick background to my to that point, before that I was in philosophy. I did my master's degree in philosophy,
Okay.
and what happened there that got me into education was I taught formal logic classes for the philosophy department, and I switched my field to education because I found that actually doing the teaching and trying to solve the problem of how to explain these kind of complex, not just it's not just information, but it's sort of thinking skills to students and get them to understand how this is different from other things and how you learn these things and how you understand these abstract concepts. And seeing kind of the difficulties that students kind of tended to have over and over again consistently. That was more engaging of a problem for me than doing the work I was doing in philosophy. So I wanted to switch to education. And it's sort of personal for me as well, because with my own history in computer science, for years before even that I started my master's degree, I had tried a number of times to learn programming on my own and hadn't had much success with it. But I'd always been sort of drawn to it and thought it would be a useful skill and thought it was an interesting um, thing to learn. And I tried a number of times on my own to learn it without much success
Mm.
until eventually, right around the time that I was finishing my master's and entering my PhD, I was able to take some online classes. I found some of the new kind of tools that were being developed around that time, 7, 8 years ago, that were getting better and better, I thought, from the resources that I had seen in previous sort of attempts to learn programming. But I could still sort of see that there was an issue
Mm.
that
Mhm.
made this field in particular, made programming in particular hard to learn, and I wanted to kind of understand better why. And so that combination of my skills doing the, or my experiences doing the teaching in my master's degree and kind of the personal experiences I had with programming, once I got into my PhD program, I kind of immediately gravitated towards computer science, where it was this combination of doing a lot of the same things I was trying to do when teaching logic and figuring out how to get students to develop these abstract problem solving skills.
Mhm.
And it, like I mentioned, it's also personal to me because I saw that there was a unique sort of difficulty in learning how to program, and it wasn't like learning other things. And I really wanted to approach how we could solve that problem.
That is so fascinating to me. I'm an education researcher myself, and in the K-12 environment, and I was a high school English teacher prior. And
Okay.
yeah, I can kind of relate to some of those things where you were talking about with kind of like students and formal logic versus abstract problem solving. Like that's definitely something that comes up when we're teaching English and grammar, because they aren't always as concrete as other subjects. So
Yeah,
I really
definitely.
appreciate you saying that. Yeah. And that was part of your research that drew me to wanting to have this conversation with you.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about your research and how it covers student motivation and some of those maybe dispositional factors with their learning. Can you tell me a little bit more about this and your research in that area?
Yeah, so my research in computer science education has focused a lot on the motivational end of things. A lot of my research has surrounded the concept of the construct of self-efficacy. I've
Mhm.
also done some research looking at students' emotional experiences. I've looked at dispositional factors as well, like in my dissertation research. Many researchers in computer science education and definitely historically have focused more on the cognitive, like the cognitive demands in terms of like the working memory capacity and like the like
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of more mechanical aspects of how students can understand these concepts and like figuring out, oh,
Hmm.
this is sort of a schema for explaining this concept that makes sense for the way our brains work and that kind of thing. Um,
Exactly.
I've approached it more from the motivational aspect just because I've seen in my own experiences and I've seen in my experiences teaching that a lot of times the most difference is made by understanding the learning process itself and kind of having this metacognitive understanding of what's going on when you're trying to learn something complicated like this and understanding the way that the learning process should go and understanding that failure it doesn't necessarily reflect a lack of ability but it's sort of part of the process and
Mm.
being able to deal with in learning programming. I think there's this particular type of experience that students have that's sort of unique to other even STEM fields, I would say, and this is a term I'm taking from some research by Keenan and Simon. They had a series of papers 2010, 2011, 2012 about this, but they called it the struck by lightning experience, where you think that you're understanding what's
Mm.
going on when you're learning how to program, and then all of a sudden you go to a compiler to run your code, and you get hit in the face by this out of the blue error message. And I think that that's for a lot of people, myself included, that's can be an emotionally difficult thing to deal with when you sort of get confronted very abruptly by the reality that like what you thought you understood, you didn't necessarily understand. Um, and so I think that the motivational and emotional aspect of things is very important because I think that getting students to be able to learn programming has just as much to do with as much to do with the cognitive. It has to do with the understanding and how the learning process should go, and not being discouraged, and being able to contextualize the times that you fail, and being able to contextualize the emotional difficulties that you have. I think those are just as important as the cognitive aspects of learning this material. And so I've drilled down on self-efficacy, which is students' self-beliefs that they're able to do the necessary behaviors to get a desired outcome. That's the sort of technical definition of it. And so I've looked at that a lot in computer science, and it's sort of well known in educational psychology literature that it has a positive impact on students' outcomes in basically every field and every kind of situation. And I found that in my research to be the case too in computer science. And then I've also kind of drilled down on other things, looking at gender differences, looking at the change over time in self-efficacy. And the thing that's important about self-efficacy is not just that it's predictive of students' outcomes at the end of the course, say, if you measure it at the beginning, but it's also something that there's room, just based on the nature of the construct, given that students are consistently adjusting and modifying their self-efficacy beliefs based on the feedback that they're getting from the learning process, that there's room for us to get in with pedagogical interventions to help students to have better outcomes based on the self-efficacy kind of getting to them before their self-efficacy drops off to a point where they don't think that they can do it, and they don't set more ambitious goals for themselves anymore, and they're not able to be resilient in the face of challenges. The emotional side of things as well. Some of my research has looked at when students' experiences of, say, frustration. If they have significant experiences of frustration, say in the beginning of a programming course, we can still see in the data that I collected that there's an impact of that, a negative impact on those experiences of frustration from the first couple weeks of the course on the work that they're doing at the very end of the course. And so it's an important thing to manage and to help students with the way that you're designing your course to manage the sort of negative emotional impacts. Not necessarily that you could ever make it so that there never were any of those, but kind of getting them in a position where they can manage these things is really important, and especially at the beginning of the course when students are new to the field and they're in that first programming course, helping them to not have these sort of initial drop-offs in negative emotional experiences and drop-offs in their self-efficacy is really important for their ultimate outcomes in the course, is sort of the takeaway of what my research is pointed to.
Oh, that is so awesome. And I can't wait for other educators to hear that part because it's so, I think we downplay the importance of students' beliefs in themselves. And sometimes we might get caught up in, like you said, maybe the cognitive approaches to addressing outcomes. But there's really a lot to be said about the motivation and the self-belief and that emotional part of learning. That's not always highlighted as much as it could be in pre-service teacher education. So it's really great to see your research bring that back around and say, hey, this is a statistically significant approach to helping student outcomes improve. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah, and what I sometimes say is that I think that for most people who teach computer science, I think that they would agree that if they could control all of their students' behaviors perfectly throughout the course, that they would feel very confident they could get good learning outcomes for everybody. So it's a matter of those behaviors, which are obviously mediated by these different motivational and emotional factors. But if you could somehow remove that as a factor, I think that teachers would be very confident they could get good results. So that's why it's so important to get in and address those.
Okay. Great. So lastly, for our researchers who are interested in learning more about the field or who are in this field, where should they start? And what are some of the current research questions in the field that are being explored? Like, how can they pick up this conversation and continue it?
Yeah. So just in terms of where to go, one resource that I think is really useful in sort of a compact form kind of summarizes a lot of the history of the field and a lot of the different aspects of the research that are going on right now. I mean, it's a large book, but it's the computing handbook of computing, sorry, the Cambridge Handbook of Computing Education Research that came out in 2018. I did a chapter in that handbook about the motivational and emotional stuff that my research had focused on. But it's a large book with a lot of other chapters that kind of contextualize how the research in this field has actually covered some important questions before and how the debates have evolved, and then also just looking at the research that's current about a lot of different topics that are of interest. Another thing I'll note, just in terms of where people can go, if and this book might be harder to come by, I'm not sure how available it is online, but another place I would recommend if somebody wanted to get more about the field, what's kind of unique about, I think it's across computer science, but so in computer science education too, more so than other education research fields, that the conference proceedings are super important venues for publications. So the main sort of, or I guess I would say the most hardcore research focused conference in computer science education is the ICER conference, that's ICER. And so looking at the proceedings of those would kind of give you, for the most recent edition of the conference that just happened about a month and a half ago, would give you a sense of some very current topics that are being discussed, research that's being done in the field. There's also the SIGC conference, the SIGCSE. That's a larger conference that's more, I think, practitioner oriented. So if people were more oriented that way, that would be maybe the place to look first. For a long time, there was sort of the perception that research at the SIGC conference was kind of less rigorous and less quality than what is at the ICER conference or what's in journals. But I think that especially over the last 5 to 10 years, that's substantially gotten better, and there's a lot of good research being done there, and a lot of interesting findings are happening there. So I would look at those proceedings from those two conferences. There's also the journals in computer science education, the ACM Transactions on Computing Education, and then the other journal is just called Computer Science Education. But honestly, a lot of people in the field, they first turn to these conference proceedings and less often look at these journal articles, but there's definitely important research being done in both sides of that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for this great introduction. And I hope that it has inspired others to kind of look more into some of the things you mentioned as it has inspired me this morning. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, definitely. And listeners, if you want to get in touch with Dr. Alex Lishinski, if you have any questions, you can reach their website at www.alexlishinski.com. And this will all be pasted in the description of this YouTube video as well. So I appreciate you listening. And again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.